This video is about who pays for utilities and insurance in a residential lease. So first thing to know about this topic is that it's completely negotiable among the parties. So based on who has more bargaining power, they could try to shift the cost to the other party. So completely negotiable. Now, what's the general standard that you see? The general standard that you see is, first of all, it's going to depend on the utility. If the tenant can easily put the utility in their own name, then obviously they are generally going to be responsible for that utility. So anything like cable, television, anything of that nature, tenant obviously is going to take ownership of that, and there's no reason for the landlord to even get involved in that anymore because they can go in their own name. Now, the next key factor in terms of who's going to pay for the utility is whether that utility can be separately metered. So let's take a single family residential house, right? Tenants should be responsible for all utilities. It all is one building, all the utilities are tied to one meter, and the tenant is the only one using that building. So obviously in there, it would make no sense for the landlord to pay any utilities. Tenants should cover everything. Now it gets more tricky when we have multifamily properties or separate units. Now, what's going to depend here is whether or not the units are separately metered. What separately metered means is that a specific utility, the bill can be broken down between the different units. If the units are separately metered, whether residential or commercial, and you can get a specific reading on utility for that specific unit, then the tenant normally will be obligated to put that in their name and take on that utility. So that's pretty standard. Again, negotiable, but that's what you'll see in most cases because it makes the most sense if it keeps the tenant honest, that they know it's their use, they'll stay fair and honorable in their usage and not overdo it if they know they have to pay. If they don't have to pay, then sure, they'll take it. The motivation, they don't have any financial motivation to keep usage fair because they don't have to pay the bill. So the landlord's going to have more motivation to keep the bill reasonable and not have excessive use. Now, it gets tricky where the units are not separately metered. So there's one general bill. And then who's going to pay this general bill? Think about multifamily. You could have 4 units, and if for some reason it's not separately metered, you just get one large bill. And who's going to pay for it, right? Now the landlord may pay for it in this scenario because it has to be in his name, right? Because it's 4 units, they're not separately metered. It probably has to go to the landlord's name. So in that case, he may pay for it. But what you also see many times is the landlord will pass the cost on to the tenant. Rather than they'll pay for it, they'll handle the mechanics, but they'll bill the tenant for the utilities through their lease. Now they could do it in a few ways. They could do it based on square footage, right? So each unit owner pays the specific utility that can't be metered based on square footage of usage. So if you own 25% if your unit was 25% of the building as a whole, then you'd pay 25% of the bill. That's one way you could do it, fairly to all the tenants they could agree to. You could also do it based on historic usage. So if you know that a certain unit uses X amount of the water in the building, or an estimate of that amount they would use, then you could have them pay their proportion based on the history, or the parties could just reach some other agreement. Like I said, it's fully negotiable. The parties could reach some other agreement among them. Now, regardless, the landlord should always have a provision in the lease that requires the tenants, regardless of who's paying, not to overuse the utilities unnecessarily, because it just could create other problems, and make sure they take care of the property, so including utility systems. Insurance, now that's utilities. Insurance, so who pays for the insurance, that's going to depend on residential versus commercial leases. Now, for residential leases, for property damage insurance, landlord is almost always going to cover that. I don't think the tenant would even be able to secure such an insurance policy, but of course they could reimburse the landlord. But what you normally see is the landlord's going to cover the property damage insurance with their own landlord's policy, and the tenant won't compensate for that. Now, the landlord should also consider having provisions in the lease, one where the tenant cannot use the property in such a way to increase the insurance, and then if they were to use the property in a dangerous manner, for example, if they broke a bunch of stairs on the property or crashed their car into the wall or did something like this that would incur an insurance claim, then the landlord's insurance premium is going to go up. Then you should pass that cost to the tenant because they caused your insurance cost. So you have the landlord's name, but have a provision that if they act in such a way that increases your insurance with not malfeasance, like illegal conduct, but in a negligent way, then you pass that cost onto them, and that will at least keep them honest. And particularly if you make the point to them being least, hey, look, I'm keeping this my eye out if my insurance is going to go up. And it's also becoming a bigger issue now with all the weather events that insurance is going up, and the insurance companies are being sticklers about how they're going to issue the policy and the costs. But you should also, in addition to that provision, the landlord could also have a provision that requires the tenant to maintain renter's insurance. That doesn't cover property damage, but it will make sure it'll cover the tenant's property. So in case they say the landlord fails on the building somehow, and there's a flood and the landlord was supposed to handle it, but the tenant's belongings get damaged, well, then you don't have to pay for the belongings because the tenant had tenant insurance, right? So make sure the tenant has tenant insurance. That way, if the landlord kind of messes up and damages tenant stuff, tenant still has coverage, so you don't have to come out of pocket for it. And tenant and renter's insurance is super cheap. So you might as well make the tenant get that because it's really not an expensive endeavor. Then tenant insurance often has like a personal liability and injury policy, usually a portion of it. So you can look at the specific policy, but have them get the renter's insurance to cover, if there's property damage and also some personal injury that could happen on the property. So that's how the insurance can work. Commercial is a whole different ballgame, and it could be a video on its own because it is customary for these same provisions I just mentioned. That would be applicable for commercial, but for commercial, in many cases, the landlords, the tenants will cover insurance. And now, if it's like a commercial, if it's one unit among many in like a common area, then the landlord will usually have like a master insurance policy and pass the cost directly to each tenant based on the square footage that they have. So like the CAM charges or common area maintenance charges. So tenants will cover the insurance almost always for those type of buildings being passed through on the square footage basis we talked about. But there's also always requirements for the commercial tenants to have a bunch of different insurances, like business insurance, sometimes business interruption insurance, a whole list of insurances that the commercial tenants will have to get. So it does change the game dramatically if it's a commercial tenant.